Spiritual Nomad Podcast. I have Justin Foster back on the Spiritual Nomad Podcast today. We did a show about a year ago and had a really good time talking about just the journey of faith and entering into a more mystic or non-dual consciousness. And it's kind of long overdue, I almost feel like, because I felt like there was a lot left in that conversation that we didn't even get to touch on. And so recently with this reboot of the Spiritual Nomad Podcast, I've invited Justin to come back on and have a conversation. So Justin, thank you for joining me here on the podcast today, man.
Thank you, Luke. I love what you do. It's very important in the world. So thank you for leading these type of conversations.
Yeah, man. And you know, what I love about, thank you. And likewise is, I think what I want to say is because the way that I first came in contact with you, and anybody that listened to the first episode, I'm going to regurgitate a little bit, but you maybe have just started the Foster Thinking Instagram. You're just doodling these thoughts and posting them and these musings. And it was the account that my wife and I were doing for a little bit of time, which for anybody that maybe have joined the Spiritual Nomad through that route, it was Common Conversations. My wife and I were doing like a little marriage podcast, and that's how we got in touch with you. Initially, it was through that. And I was just inspired by how it just seemed like these were like handwritten tweets that had almost like a proverb like punch to them. You know what I mean? And it was just every single post that I was seeing, I was just like, yes, this is the way, whatever way this is, whatever, mindset that Justin's having, I'm experiencing it in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, man, it's been so cool just to see you and so many other, like this Insta community that's kind of came up to be like it almost seems like a lot of us are on the same trajectory and the same path. And so for those of us, just a quick maybe update for somebody that might be new to you, to your story and your work, as you entered in more of the path of non-dual thinking, living, being, into more mysticism. How did you first get introduced to some of this? What was your story before that? Kind of walk us through a little bit of your initial spiritual awakening and what that has kind of evolved to become. Okay. So a big question. Feel free to take all the time, but to introduce people to you in that way, on that side of you.
So I was raised in a fundamentalist church. It has no name, but if you look for it on Wikipedia, the Wikipedia entry is under 2x2s is what the Wikipedia entry is, but there's no official name of this church. And it was fundamental. It is a fundamentalist church that is home-based. It's quite simple. It's sort of the antithesis of evangelical megachurch, bands and, that sort of production. This is very stripped down and simple home-based church. And I was raised in it. I was a resistant member because my mom and dad went, and then got married. My partner at the time, she was part of the church, and then we had kids, and I wanted, basically, I needed a system, Luke, to guide me, because I had no real structure of how to be a parent or an adult or a believer from my childhood. Not really. I mean, because of, primarily trauma-based experiences in the home. And so I refer to this phase, this like 25-year phase or period of time being part of this as it was an incubator period. And it helped me understand, like really understand the Bible, because this particular church has no other source, in fact, you would be very discouraged by the leaders of the church to read anything other than the Bible.
Really?
And so any sort of literature, like reading something like Rob Bell or even going like over to the more of the traditional evangelical stuff, Swindell and those guys, I didn't know who any of those people were, because it's not that we weren't allowed. It was just like, it was a similar code for not having a television. Very few people had a television. for the similar reason. It was like a spoken rule,
Yeah.
or something.
Nothing to taint
And
the
again,
holiness of what was
right.
happening
Yeah.
there. Right.
In the period, and I assume, now where I'm at after lots of deconstruction and therapy and spiritual growth, that it's mostly well-intended. There was a lot of negative things about that experience, but I think some of those rules were well-intended to sort of protect you from the world, air
Yeah.
quotes. And so, in 2014, I had a spiritual awakening, and I really think that spiritual awakening probably started in 2010. It just took me 4 years for it to crack open.
Yeah.
And at that point, I just realized that I don't believe this. I don't believe this is the only. I don't believe in the exclusivity of the church. I don't believe in their stance on LGBTQ matters. I do not believe in their stance on social justice. I do not believe in the infallibility of the ministry or the ineffability of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't believe any of those things, and so I ended up in part of that moving to Austin, and I tried going again with the community that's here of that church, and it was even more conservative and stringent and dry. And I walked away January of 2016, and I've never been back to a church service other than I think I went to a church location to vote, I think,
Yeah.
and to go to a Christmas musical thing that I went to. And I don't have any particular calling to return to a church. I refer to myself as a spiritual libertarian. Like if somebody goes to church, I like the way Eugene Peterson talked about it. He's like, when they asked him, what church should I go to? He goes, go to the nearest, smallest one.
Yeah.
Which is great advice if you feel a need to be part of a community. What's happened for me instead, Luke, is meeting people like you and many, many others that are believers, but they're much more Gnostic or mystical or, mystical in their approach to matters of Jesus and God and the Spirit and things like that.
Yeah.
And so that's my background as far as this goes. And yeah, that's how I got here. And then I wasn't until, and there's not a lot of details I can get into because there's a lot of moving parts with this part of my life right now, but I realized in September, I'm having a second awakening.
Yeah.
And I think the first awakening freed me from the constructs of the conditions, the church, living in Idaho, various things that didn't feed my soul, and moved to Austin, had this, this reset of life, but then kind of a 2-year period, 2018, 2019 of stagnation. And then 2020 hits. And again, it was probably an awakening that started earlier, but what I realized that this is freeing me from the construct of myself.
Mm.
So if the first awakening freed me from conditions, this one is freeing me from the constructed me.
Yeah.
That is the one that has a propensity for codependency, easily distracted, low motivation, a bit performative, like the person that my being created to sort of make it in the world. And I wrote about this on one of my essays. If people go to fosterthinking.com, they can see that I write a weekly essay. And one was a few months ago, it was called The Premonition. And it was sharing, I'd never shared it publicly before, that I had a premonition about 10 years ago that I would die before I was 50. And I did. My constructed self is dead.
Yeah.
And it took about the last 2.5 months of spiritual hospice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do feel like that part of me that I created in order to make it in the world and to find connection and meaning and acceptance and safety, he's gone. And all that's left is me right now.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be other iterations. The ego always grows back while you're still alive.
Yeah.
And there'll probably be another iteration of this in a few years, but this is where I'm at today as a person that is a deeply, I'm a deep believer in the concept of more of a spiritual more like John and Mary Magdalene and maybe Thomas,
Yeah.
as opposed to Paul's take on it all.
Yeah.
So,
So is that something in this awakening? Is there like elements of that? I'm curious. So like I've had different iterations of these sort of awakenings, and like what you've said, and I'm not sure if we talked about it before we hit record or not, but it's like you have this sort of initial sort of
mhm.
awakening and you think that was it, and then
Yeah,
oh wait
right.
a second, another
Yeah.
one. And it's like and it's this notion of being born again,
Right.
again. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's shorter periods of time, sometimes it's longer periods of time, but it's this consistent like death and rebirth, the cycle that we flow in with ourself that matches not only nature but the cosmos, right? It's this
Mhm.
constant death and rebirth. But just like seasons, there's always like elements that mark those seasons. Is it something that you sensed that was approaching and coming on? Did it hit you more abruptly, or like in the Midwest where I grew up in Indiana, when you start getting that first sort of cool breeze in the fall, you're
Mhm.
like, the leaves are about to start changing.
Yeah.
Did you
Yeah.
have some of that around this second awakening?
Only in hindsight.
Okay.
I left. I left September 1st to drive to Portland for the birth of our grandson, and by the time I returned a month later, my life was extremely different.
Yeah.
Very, very different. Um, and so the conditions changed, the circumstances changed, and then from that, I did not, it's not like I realized in the midst of it of like all of these like personal changes that happened sort of to my external environment, relationships and living situations and things like that. I didn't realize it was a spiritual awakening probably until like mid-October.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Um, and it is something like that. It does appear, and I don't know how many awakenings there are. There could be many awakenings. I think it's dependent on everybody's experience.
Totally.
But there was a sense of like, okay, I'm done in 2014. Like, okay, I get it. I've had this realization. I made these changes, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't believe that anymore. Partially because that first awakening was a little bit like, I think like when Jesus put the mud on the blind guy's eyes. Like it said the first time that he looked, that he saw trees as men walk, or men as trees walking. I
Yeah.
think that's the term that was used, the King James version anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think that was it. I think I did see, but I think that the biggest thing that has changed for me in this second awakening is kind of three things, Luke. One is to have a pure heart.
Mm.
I have, as a survival mechanism, have allowed and encouraged deceit and truth to mix.
Mm.
It's a little bit like chicken McNuggets, where what are they, like 40% chicken? Enough.
Yeah.
They're just enough chicken that the Food and Drug Administration or the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, can say that you can sell them as chicken.
Right.
And there was an element of that with me, with my spirituality and my morality and my behaviors of, I could call them chicken McNuggets, but it wasn't organic chicken,
Right. Right.
and so that's that pure heart, is just organically removing guile and all these. And I realize now what they were is they were coping mechanisms. They were connection mechanisms to try to survive after, it's quite devastating to spend your childhood not feeling loved
Mm.
and by the people that are supposed to love you. Now that's changed. My relationship with one of my parents is beautiful, and I'm very happy about it. But it still leaves you with sort of stunted as far as your ability to accept optimism and always tell the truth and everything, because you're a survivor. You become a scavenger to try to
Yeah.
make it in the world. So that's number one, living with a pure heart. Number two is living from my center. So I've really practiced understanding, and this is why I was so excited to be asked to be on your show, is because I talk a lot about the core self and finding your center. Well, as a believer, I think that's the Christ within.
Yeah.
I think that's the Christ consciousness that we're accessing, and we all have it.
Yes.
Which is why someone like Hafiz, who was a Sufist, would say something like, I am the hole in the flute that the breath of Christ passes through, hear my music.
Yes.
So he referenced Christ. And that wasn't a biblical, it wasn't about Jesus. It was about this energy inside of him that I believe is sacral and sacred to every single human being, and what separates us from the animals to some extent, to a large extent.
Yes. Yes.
And so living from the center, and I'm learning, actually taking a course on Insight Timer to learn centering prayer, learning about these ideas of, I want to be in union with my core self, knowing that that will then put me in union with God and spirit.
Yeah.
And then if I can do that, then my life has been almost like a series, like a puzzle with pieces missing. And I assumed that other people were those puzzle pieces. And I treated other people often as that. Like, you're here to complete this puzzle for me.
Yeah.
And what I realize now is more like the diagram of the overlapping circles, what we call a Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Where it's actually, there's another term for it, something Pisces, and it escapes me now what that's called.
Yeah.
Where I want to be in union with other people, whether it's a friendship or any other kind of relationship. I want overlapping circles. I don't want a pie piece or a puzzle piece. I want wholeness of being. And that's where living from your center comes, because that's the part of you that's unbreakable, unrejectable, whole, beautiful. It's the part that God sees.
Yeah.
And so that's it. And then the third thing that I'm really focusing on now in my spiritual path is living a true story. Living a true story. So I think that's a kind of a combination. If you live from your center and you have a pure heart, you're going to live a true story, but it still remains an intention.
Yeah.
And what the interesting thing about this is, I've struggled to have boundaries. I used a lot of emotional nudity with people over the years, which is, I just would be like, hey, this is what happened to me.
Yeah.
I'm
guilty.
I had a violent childhood. Please like me. Yeah. And I always had basically one boundary in that experience, which was in or out, ride or die. And I would use my story of my weird ass story of ranch and church and everything. And then when my former partner came out as gay 5 years ago, like I kind of reintroduced victimization, like poor Justin, his wife's gay, like that type of attitude. And what happened for me in all of that is a realization that I wasn't living a true story. And so in order to live a true story, I have to have some boundaries. I can't practice emotional nudity with people that aren't ready for that.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Right. And that's a new thing for me, to be able to establish a boundary around that, because I've been seeking much of my life for acceptance or connection in the process.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, you write a lot about ego and the death of ego and how that has played a part of this sort of awakening? And because through those 3 points that you just mentioned, kind of the enemy, if you will, of those is the ego that doesn't want the progression of those things. Like, even the true story, you think of the true self, or I've referenced it as like, it's the true narrative that is written within you,
Yes, that's
and there's a false narrative that's written in.
Yes.
It's the spirit and the flesh, if you want to use some Pauline language, which I'm always leery to do, but can you talk a little bit about what that has been and your writings around the ego and how that has been sorted through with that?
Yeah. And that's been evolutionary as well. Is I don't believe anymore in the death of the ego. I believe in ego death, which is different. So the ego produces constructs. It's a illusion maker.
Yeah.
And every time we have a traumatic experience, there's this deconstruction that happens. And then as soon as the next day after some sort of big spiritual moment, the ego begins to rebuild the illusion. And where I'm at now is, I don't want to be a spiritual Puritan. I don't want to be the type of person that you see this, especially in more of the secular New Age movement of like, basically like secular, this is maybe going to offend some people, but like secular Southern Baptists, like super judgy around like, oh, you're not a vegan and you're not a progressive.
Yes.
And, like, and all of that. And it's no coincidence to me that crowd is also part of the conspirituality movement. So they've kind of lumped themselves together with the wackadoodles at QAnon.
Yeah.
Because that type of spirituality is a mental illness, in my opinion, to put it bluntly. I think it's the ego hijacking the soul and calling it spirituality when it's not spirituality. It's just repackaged ego. Anyway,
Right.
editorial aside on that.
It's
What I
another
think
fundamentalism,
exactly. I call it neo-fundamentalism. It's
Yeah.
a different kind of fundamentalism, and it's based on the same things. That's probably its own separate conversation.
Hmm.
But where that comes from is Jesus never shamed the ego of somebody else. He didn't shame the ego. He did not condemn the ego. He pointed it out. He
Hmm.
pointed it out, and he could be rather blunt about how he pointed it out. But it wasn't like there was no kill your ego.
Right.
The other part of this is related to without that ego death, there's no opportunity for resurrection.
Hmm.
And so I think that can happen multiple times. I think the ego will build a construct, and the cleansing light of truth will shine on it, and you'll be like, oh, I created this construct because I was worried. Because it's always fear-based.
Right.
And this goes to extending yourself grace. The only reason for the ego, that exists in our being, is to keep us alive. That's it. It's not evil.
Right.
It's not wicked. I do not believe in at all. Like, I am so anti the concept of original sin, because I think it's a violation of everything Jesus taught.
Yes. Come on, my man. So
yeah.
good.
And so it's operating from this idea, like I think it's easy for people that have had some level of spiritual awareness to go, well, it's just my ego. That's my ego making me do that. And it's easy to make it an enemy, but it's not the enemy. I love Ryan Holiday, but I don't believe the ego is the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
I think
then you just create yourself to be a victim again.
Right. I think the enemy is low consciousness.
Yeah.
And lack of awareness. And just because you're spiritually awake, we are dual creatures. We're part spirit, part animal. Yeah. Just because you're spiritually awakening doesn't mean that you don't have areas that don't need to have the light of awareness shine up on them. Mm-hmm. And so I think ultimately here, it's to allow those ego those constructs to die, let those ego deaths go, let them happen, and then just be in a place, if you're centered in yourself, centered in your being and your core self, the ego doesn't have much influence. Because here's a powerful thing about it: when you open your heart, it does not close the mind. When you let your ego run things, it does close the heart. So the reverse isn't true. So the goal then is to make the ego an employee, not a boss.
Yeah.
A servant, not a taskmaster. And that's a daily thing, but it's much easier to do that from your center with an open heart than it is to try to go out and purge yourself of ego influence, which I think is folly.
Yeah.
And actually probably dangerous.
Totally. I think of it in terms like I always sometimes share with people about about the idea of using the ego or allowing the ego to use you. Who's the tool?
That's right.
Who's really the tool here in between those two? And I think that there is that sort of, we want to enter into non-dual, but there is a level of dualism that we will always be prone to, because we are human beings. The way that we are functioning in this world based on evolution and whatever else you might factors, there are going to be times that you have to look at life in the dueling lenses. And the beauty comes whenever we can transcend that, but that doesn't always happen on a daily basis.
Right.
You have to make decisions, and we're constantly, and I think that sometimes like the turn of the century movement that was very focused on like cause and effect, like folks like James Allen, who wrote As a Man Thinketh, or people like that, or the guy who wrote In Tune at the Infinite,
you got
Ralph
William
Waldo
Blake.
Trine. I have it sitting right here.
Evelyn Underhill, William Blake, James.
There's like they talk about the mind of the garden, and you're either going to have weeds grow or you can till it, and there is this sort of like dual cause and effect that is a reality in our life. It might not be everything. I think we've kind of understood that more as we've grown in sort of spirituality and mysticism becoming more mainstream in a way, if you will. But there is still that element that we have a decision to make, and we have some sort of authoritative license to give way to ego or not ego, but it will never fully be dead or killed because
Right.
it's our avatar. And I think that's
Right.
something that a lot of people talk about is the death of their ego, but it's really just like, I love the way that you're saying, and just really to say all this to affirm it, is understanding the proper place. And usually anything that is out of order creates out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen is just this like catawampus
Mm-hmm.
of the ego being exalted so much that it's
Right.
like a weird shaped tire, you know, like a
Yeah.
flat
Right.
spot on the tire. And you're like,
Right.
this
Yeah.
isn't right, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just thinking about this too. Like the ego is what we compare with. And that's a useful tool.
Mm-hmm.
The ego is what creates drive. That's a
Yeah.
useful tool. It's the ego that wants to connect with people and create sort of the tribal bonds. That's a good thing. That's the ego creates community to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only when it's undisciplined or when it is, when we know we've experienced or in many different versions of what happens when someone is fully consumed by their ego.
Yeah.
It produces a kind of madness or cognitive dissonance when that happens. And I think that when you disassociate yourself from your thoughts and you realize that I would put it this way, almost all, maybe I'll be bold and say all of the ego responses that we have are biological.
Mm.
It's just our animal imprint. And we're just more advanced than other animals in the way that we imprint with social conditioning.
Yeah.
But it's only so what the ego does is the ego produces the illusion of separateness, that, oh, this is Justin and this is Justin's soul. Like, I'll admit that there's a soul, but it's separate.
Yeah.
And the ego really ultimately needs to attach to something because it's not real. So
Mm-hmm.
it'll lock onto your mind and it'll create illusions and idolatry and a bunch of other things. It'll lock into your heart and it will create deceit. It will lock into your body and create mysterious pain and illness. But that's just because it's trying to attach to something so that it can exist in the world.
Yeah.
When we understand what it is, that it's a biological response that produces a psychological response, then it's like, oh, well, which then goes back to Jesus's behavior and teaching.
Yeah.
He fed the 5,000 plus, yes, out of compassion, but also out of pure practicality, because it's hard for people to hear any sort of spiritual message when you're hungry.
Right.
Right. And I always love the balance that Jesus modeled between the 3D world and the spiritual world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the role of every mystic. And I think everyone connected to their soul is a mystic. And I think everyone disconnected from their heart is a narcissist.
Mm.
If you're connected to your soul, you're a mystic in some form. Maybe it's art, maybe it's healing, maybe it's friendship, maybe it's support, who knows? But the role of the mystic is to show how to do what Jesus did, which is to operate in the world from your center and balancing the 3D needs with our material needs with the spiritual world.
Yeah.
Understanding that there is a capital R reality that is the spiritual world, and everything outside of the spiritual world is primarily an illusion.
Yeah.
In our minds, or it's just part of nature.
Yeah. 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 Seeing the physical as a response or a manifestation of the spiritual.
Right.
And so you talk a lot about Jesus a lot, even in this conversation. I know it's probably because you're talking to, me and my disposition as being a pastor and all of that, which if you're listening this far in, even me just saying that's probably a little shocking, not too many pastors have talks like this, but
Right.
We're trying to change all that.
More and more are. Yeah.
Yeah. More and more are. And it's so cool. But can you talk, because a big theme that we've been doing and what I've been really focused on with the whole Spiritual Nomad podcast reboot is helping people navigate through a sort of deconstruction. And a lot of that has to do, especially in my life, was a sort of, ego death in a lot of ways. Everything that I had was wrapped up in my vocation, what I could pull off and do, who I was in the status of my church movement, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was not only a loss of all of those things, it resulted in a loss of self that spurred me into this whole other thing. And a lot of people are at this point, and I've been in the process of, quote, reconstruction, for lack of
Mm-hmm.
better terms, right now for a
Mm-hmm.
while. And I really feel like we are a part of that, helping people
Mm-hmm.
reconstruct faith that makes sense in some way for them to actually live out. So I'm curious with you, a lot of people that go through this, they have a frustrating time talking about Jesus or revisiting the teachings of Jesus, or, even admitting any sort of Christ awareness or anything.
Mm-hmm.
What's that been that experience for you? How's your relationship with Jesus? Once again, very Christianese sort of way of saying it, but what is your
Yeah.
relationship with Christ, the Christian tradition, Jesus? Those could
Yeah.
each probably be their own individual things, but
Yeah.
how has
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
that evolved throughout your walk and journey?
Yeah. I mean, in order to have faith in anything, there needs to be some sort of governing principle or governing, or like a underlying thesis. So I believe that the purpose of the human, as it relates to a relationship with this, with the spirit, with God and the spirit, and therefore then the Christ within, is 100% about revelation and 0% about installation.
Mm,
And the reason that we need to deconstruct is almost all of what we think we believe about God and Jesus and the Bible and everything was installed.
yeah.
It wasn't part of our original operating system. That's why Jesus said, be as little children,
Mm,
because little children don't have an installed belief system that would turn the lust for power, or turn a blind eye to poor behavior, or create separation, create an other. The
yeah.
kids don't do
Yeah.
any of that stuff. So operating from that, this assumption that we're born pure, and then we become, a kind of a negative word here, but corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
We begin to, and so returning to the root of the fact that I am a sovereign being with agency that through biology God created, and then I have a soul, and I believe that I don't need to know the nuances of things like whether or not there was a virgin birth, even if there was a resurrection. I know that sounds like heresy, because it probably is. I don't need to know that. I don't need to have that as like a solid thing. All I need to know for me to operate from, as I moved from deconstruction into reconstruction over these last few years, is I need to know that I believe that the center of our being is the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, may they be with you as they've been with me.
Yeah.
And so there's a triad, or triumvirate here of what Richard Rohr refers to as the divine dance that we
Yes.
get to be a part of. But it's all inward, which is why I always say, if anyone on any issue in life gives you an outside formula, especially related to your soul, they're a grifter.
Mm,
They're a grifter or a narcissist or both.
yeah.
Because we have, without installation, we have spiritual genetic material in us that is the same as Jesus Christ and God in him or her or itself.
Yeah.
Like that's the same thing. That's what's, and I do this when I talk to people that are more secular, more atheistic or agnostic in their view. It's like, all I want you to know, I want to know why humans have free choice and agency. Not 100%. We have a lot of subconscious stuff, but we have free choice and agency, and we're the only creatures that do.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? How did that happen from an evolutionary standpoint?
Yeah.
And then I like to challenge. I much prefer to argue with fundamentalists and evangelicals, because I
Yeah.
can outquote the Bible.
Yeah.
But around this idea of, how do you know that? Like, how do you know that? Do you ever question what you believe? Because if you don't, you're missing out on the inquiry that's necessary for spiritual growth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Faith. I mean, what is faith then, if it isn't going to pursue
yeah,
that sort of route of inquiry?
right. And it's also, again, back to installation versus revelation. In church conditioning, you're given a set of beliefs. This is the doctrine, the doctrinal statement. This is and then you, when you bump up against inconsistencies, those are sort of waved off.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, you begin to think that there's something wrong with you at your core, because no one can adhere to the illusion of some outside model. No one can.
Right.
And so you get that, like, well, the only perfect person was Jesus. And think, well, first of all, that's not what perfect means in the Bible. I mean,
Right.
Jesus may have been perfect in purity, of course, but
complete is a better translation.
Yeah, complete is a better translation. Exactly. So this with deconstruction, you need to be comfortable with being wrong. You need to be humble about it. And then it goes back to faith, where faith is not, and I wrote this as a musing several years ago, which is Christianity, modern, in the last 1600 years, Christianity took the box that light came in and killed the light and worshiped the box.
Yeah.
Like the church is the thing that's worshiped, or people that talk about like my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and they're very like sort of like superstar Jesus. Yeah. Well, he specifically said not to do that. I mean, it's black and white in the scripture, in the known scripture that we have. So to this thing about faith, to me, faith is embracing the unknown, that God and spirit are all in all of the unknown things, the things that don't make any sense, like the timing of the events that have happened in my life the last 3 months. None of it makes any damn sense. Yeah. Because it's not supposed to, because faith in something that makes sense is intellect, and intellect is installation. Yeah.
Yes. So good. So good. So the way that you have broke a lot of that down, and you're seeing Jesus in these different ways, and imitation, like I like a lot of like the I'm forgetting the term exactly, the theological term. Essentially, it's like we mirror Jesus. Like that's the sort of thing. It's not any sort of like, Jesus is the God and Savior that we worship, which Jesus very, like his prayer in John 17 is that that all, not only his disciples, he prays for himself, he prays for his disciples, and then he prays for anyone that would follow in the way throughout all the ages, that they would be one as we are one. And if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, but the Father has sent me. And it's this whole weird sort of language,
Yeah. I love, Luke, I love how, though, on a couple of things on that, which is, why was Jesus, who only had 3.5 years to get this word out, and with no ad campaign and no PR person, no publicist, why was he so obtuse? And I think it's because he was making certain that it would not take intellect to have revelation. I think that's what it was. And it was also, this is why I'm amused in a kind way, I hope, towards people that think the Bible's literal. It's like, well, that era of which it was crafted, as far as like the time period, was all allegorical, all metaphorical, all nonlinear in its approach. Right. And so I think these, I go back to this, like what I believe is the greatest leadership commandment of all time, which is follow me. Yeah. When Jesus said that, I don't think he meant copy him. I think what he meant was go inward, go inward, go inward, go inward. If someone comes to you, I mean, Buddha said, if someone calls themselves the Buddha, then you should kill them. Which is a violent thing for a Buddhist to say, but this idea that there is no outside savior, that's a construct. Jesus never referred to himself as a savior. Right.
At best, a prophet.
At best, a prophet, and the son of he mostly referred to himself as the Son of Man. Right. The last little bit on this too, that is, I love this idea too, is that Jesus said, they will do greater things than me. Yes. Well, if that's the case, that means the only way to do greater things than Jesus is to go inward and find what your special gift is. Yeah. And that goes back to purpose and mission and this divine charter that every single human being has if they do the inner work to get to it.
Yeah. So good. And that's a lot of the work that you do in the world with helping people understand the inner life and ask the questions and go to those places and navigate through all of that. And so super grateful for friends like you that are helping this move. I mean, it's a movement that's happening in this direction. And I think that, folks like us, among many, many others, that are helping to walk people not only into deconstruction, but into a sort of reconstructed reality. And I think this understanding, this awareness, this inner work that happens is the beginning and the continuation that we'll always have to have of reconstructing faith in our life.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. And which is why I think too, that the shift really started in the mid 60s of the evangelical community away from doing the work in the streets to doing the work in political office was really the beginning of the end of American Christianity. And what I see in you, in Rob Bell, Phil Drysdale, David Hawthorne, others out there, Sarah Blessey, I think, is one. The lady that passed, Rachel.
Oh, Rachel Held Evans, yeah.
And others we could name. Is I believe that God is doing a rebrand. Yeah. And because when people have this aversion to, you would say, you bring up the word Jesus, and they have this, especially if there's a survivor of religious or spiritual abuse. The reason that Christianity has a terrible reputation is because they earned it.
Right.
And and it's similar to America. If we can't admit that we've got problems, then we're not really being American, because the American ideal is about freedom. And if you can't see that there's systemic racism, if you don't think you have privilege if you're white and male, that's all related to, it's what I refer to as bedazzled Jesus. You have bought into bedazzled Jesus, and who is like your financial advisor and your trauma buddy, and you've created a disassociation from your core self in order to follow this version of Jesus. I like what Rob Bell says about it when he's like, when people say, well, God did this or this or this, it was negative. He goes, yeah, I don't believe in that God either. Yeah. And so I think that there is a reformation, a renaissance that's happening. And you take these beautiful principles that Jesus taught that were, 80% overlap with what Buddha taught and Muhammad taught and Abraham taught, that there's this spiritual, it's Meister Eichert said, I think it was him that said, all mystics speak the same language. Yes. And what we're seeing is this regeneration and understanding that. That's why I said, like, it's revelation, not installation. Mm-hmm. And the way Jesus built it doesn't require any institutions. Right. It doesn't really require institutions. Yes, building community. I agree with that. But not monstrosity, 10,000 seat, churches and, preachers that fly, Gulf Streams and things like that. Dang it. Yeah. And so I think that for myself, so I'm bringing it back to myself, is I think that for my whole life, really, I sort of allowed myself to have this mixture of like belief in God and morality and stuff, but also have lots of deceit in myself, denial of realities and things. And I believe that where I'm at in life is it's a refinery. And what I hope is happening for me, and what I believe is happening with me is, as I move across this valley, because I'm not to the other side yet, that what is going to be in it is basically a different kind of intimacy with myself and humanity, a different, more wholeness, more of this wholeness of being that I talked about. Yeah. And imagine this, Luke, if more people did that, if more people were willing to deconstruct, or more people were willing to go through the very painful process of letting what they thought was true die, that elevation of consciousness, everything always gets better when consciousness elevates. Yeah. That's what bends the evolutionary curve towards good, is elevated consciousness. It's only in resisting the consciousness, resisting stuff, that you stay mired in the middle of Maslow's hierarchy. So that's where I'm at. And here's the thing. Theologically, I don't have any answers theologically, because I don't think the answers come theologically, first of all. Second of all, I might be wrong.
Yeah.
I might be wrong. I might be wrong about this. I might be wrong, completely wrong. Maybe there is some exclusive church that Jesus created that we're all supposed to be a part of, and everybody else is going to hell. I don't
Yeah.
think that's true.
Right. But
I think if you have a pure heart and you want to live a true story and you live from your core self, you know what truth is. You recognize
mhm,
truth, and mostly you recognize truth because untruth becomes distasteful. You can't
yes.
do it anymore.
Right. Right. And that's where a lot of people enter into the deconstruction movement, because there is some sort of dissonance and they can't put up with that anymore, you know?
Right.
And two,
Exactly.
like I could be completely wrong. And having that heart posture, um, in and of itself is a form of non-attachment. And
Yes.
so that is crucial in having that, because once again, what people do is what I did myself, leaving more conservative Calvinistic,
Mm-hmm.
Reformed theology, is within 18 months or less I was bought in progressive church movement completely, pendulum swing,
Mm-hmm.
and very much I might as well have still been a Calvinist in the heart, in
Mm-hmm.
some
Right.
ways.
Right. Right.
um and so I think it's easy for that pendulum to swing it, and the point is with that is that my rightness was still completely in the fabric of who I was, just on the other side. And what I love about that is I could be wrong, is not attachment. I'm not clinging. I'm in my spiritual journey is to understand, to be in tune with the infinite, and to live out of that place of true core essence, and
Yes.
whatever flows from that, so be it.
Yes. Right.
Um,
and
yeah.
and 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 to have a sort of practical mysticism, to quote Evelyn Underhill's phenomenal book back written in 2000 or 1914, to have a practical spirituality to this, which is we are supposed to operate in this world. We are supposed to try to find where our gifts and our abilities to sustain ourselves cross. We're supposed
Mhm.
to do those things. We're supposed to go out and try to heal sick people and hurt people, and um, this American evangelical Christianity that's sort of really Christian nationalism and really in a lot of ways white nationalism,
Mhm.
which is around power and exclusivity. I think that we're seeing the beginning of the end of all of that, and I do see a reemergence around this much more like personal spiritual ethos that allows people like you and I, who have we have an age difference. We've never met in person. You're part of a church community. I'm not, but we can have this fellowship on a visit like this. And I have no other term for that other than God,
Yeah.
because that's the only thing that I can understand, that's the stitching of the universe with that, where the divine world and the material world meet.
Yes.
And we sit, and this is why I say everyone really is go about the business of finding your inner mystic.
Yeah.
If you do that, you'll know what truth is. You'll know what to do. You'll know who you are. You'll know what you want. You'll be able to do a bunch of things if you just go to the inner mystic, which is essentially, taking some of what Jesus said and just giving it different terminology, which is that the kingdom of heaven is within.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the work to me. It's
Mhm.
not about, and I know that a lot of people have been hurt by religion, by Christianity, and so there's a sort of a backlash, like I'm like, the church hurt me, so I'm going to hurt back.
Yeah.
And resentment, I ran on resentment for 25 years, and it's corrosive.
Mm.
Number one, and number two is, if you don't move past the deconstruction, you'll never get to the reconstruction.
Yeah. The
And a lot of
healing.
in the healing, that's what
Yes.
exactly. And it's easy to sit in the deconstruction and go, I don't believe any of this anymore. And I'm, because that's how, what we're doing is we're processing the pain.
Yeah.
We're trying to process the pain, but by sitting in it, sitting in the rubble of what you thought was true and feeling the feelings about it, then something will emerge from that, and you'll have this direction forward.
Yes.
Um, I think it goes back to this, like I said, spiritual DNA or gnosis or Sophia,
Mhm.
or wisdom, whatever term you want to use. It's in us.
Yes.
We just got to access it.
And we have the ability to do that. And what I love is whenever I was in the heat of deconstruction about 4 years ago, a lot of people were nervous about me being on a slippery slope, And which, by the way, slippery slopes are very fun. You know,
Yes.
people pay a lot of money to go down slippery slopes up in Big Bear,
Right.
you know. But
Yes.
what I would tell people time and time again is this: if I really believe in the Holy Spirit, if I'm a true charismatic, if I'm really charisma is just to be, you know, engulfed in and
Hmm.
completely caught up into spirit. If I'm
Yeah,
really in that charismatic vein, then I'm going to believe Jesus' words. It says, the Spirit of truth will lead you into all truth.
that's right.
The Bible will not lead you into all
No,
truth. He doesn't even say, I will lead you into all
no, he never
truth.
did. Right.
The Spirit of truth will
Mhm.
lead you into all truth. And where does the Spirit live? Within.
Within. Right.
And so if you're going within, you have navigation now to
Yes.
understand that. And so what people would really be saying is I'm nervous about you because you are talking differently, thinking differently, acting differently than you used to and than I
Yes.
do.
Right.
And it's like what they really are saying is you need to follow me to be led into all truth. And I'm
Right.
saying I'm trying to be actually the most Christian person I've ever been. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I'm going to
Totally.
follow that.
Isn't it fascinating, Luke, how, and I think this goes to sort of institutionalism as its own sort of creeping issue in people, kind of ego's influence in a lot of ways. How we went from where being a Christian was subversive, being a Christian was dangerous,
Mhm.
and now we're like, "Oh, that's unsafe. You might become lost." That's what I
Right.
used to say. I'm sorry you lost. I hope you find what you're looking for, or slippery slope, or something like that. It's like, no, man. Spirit is out on the edge of things. It's not in the warm blanket. It's
Right.
not. There's no. Jesus said the foxes have holes and the birds of the air has nests, but Son of Man have no place to lay his head. Son of Man, by the way, not Son of God.
Right.
And in that's to me saying, kind of like Pema Chodron's, everything when things fall apart, is that there is an eternal impermanence to the human experience, and that is its gift.
Hmm.
That is its gift. And if you start to lock in on rigidity and forms and structures, and that's what you begin to worship, the box, as I say, then of course you're going to want safety. Of
Right.
course, I want you to tell me I'm okay the way I am, but not okay with who I really am.
Yeah.
You know, that's another common thing. I find it fascinating, that shift. It's similar to the shift you've seen again in American Christianity, away from sort of service in the streets to, like I said, like power in trying to participate and own and run power structures in the world, which
Mm.
is so anti. If you talk about the Antichrist, there's not much more Antichrist than trying to take over the government. You
Right.
know.
Yeah. That's funny. And it's true. You know, people even think about that and just obviously hearing Antichrist. I'm many people who have grown up in Christian traditions are like, they always think of the Antichrist,
Yeah.
but
No.
it's
No.
truly whatever is anti
Yes.
this spirit,
Right.
this
Right.
nature, understanding of awareness, reality.
Yes.
And there are many Antichrist, like even in Revelation, I think what John was talking about when he was in the island of Patmos, you know,
Uh-huh.
going low key crazy on an island, you
Yeah.
know, as a convict. I think that, you know, he was talking specifically about Nero and the Roman Empire and all of that was
Yeah.
happening. But what's amazing is that it duels not only in that time, but for all time, like what truth does, is
Yes.
it means something in the moment, yet transcends all of that. And I think even what you're saying is so good for us to note is that all is anti-Christ. And we have, I think, just to pull it back around to this of following the Christ way is we all have a bit of that anti-Christ within our hearts
That's right.
that has
Yes.
to be reconciled and dealt with and
Right.
consistently come around.
Right.
That's the Tao of the being of who we are.
That's exactly right. And
And yeah.
it's by design.
Hmm.
It's by
Right.
design. And I think that the best thing that anyone can do that's listening to this, that is listen to the voice of your own soul and get really curious about things that you say you believe that underneath it you don't.
Yeah.
Like, start to pull that thread.
Yes.
Start to pull that thread, and it's usually going to be something related to some societal issue or familial structure or behavior, and you pull that
Hmm.
thread and then watch what happens.
Yeah.
um, and then when you do start to pull that thread, just make sure you have people around you that really do love you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because one of the things I've noticed is that when you start pulling on the thread and you realize the church structure you're part of, you don't believe in that anymore, you get ostracized very quickly, and it's quite isolating.
Yep. Yep.
So find a little community, find almost like a deconstruction support group.
Yeah. Yeah.
To go through it together with someone.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth it.
It is
worth it. It's worth it to do that work, because when the seed cracks open, everything that you want, everything that you really want, everything your soul wants is on the other side of that kind of suffering.
Yeah.
And I think that's the promise in all of this. That is the good news.
Yeah. And having the courage to
it's
pursue
already
that.
inside of you. You don't have to pay for it.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and access it. It's going to blow the hell out of your life for a while. Yep. But on the other side of it is, like Jesus talked about, like you're going to have many sons and daughters, that kind of familial structure. Everything will change and you'll see the world differently. And to me, how powerful is that? That's amazing.
And there's a major reward for that. I think people forget that he says, no one has left father and mother and home and country for my name's sake that will not be rewarded in this life and the life to come.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that even pursuing this, it's a major reward. Having this conversation with you is a major reward that I would have never had if I would not have been like, yeah, I don't think hell is what I was, raised for it to be. You know what I mean? And that's the origin of now having conversation with you about this. And that's reward.
Yes.
And so I think if people can follow that and trust that that there really is, that the divine wants nothing more than you to be more alive, more awake, and more in tune with who, I use the word he loosely, but who he is in the purpose and place for your life. So I know I want to wrap up. I want to respect your time. And as we wrap up, you gave 3 really awesome points. You want to give any other words of wisdom for those who might be deconstructing, reconstructing? I know we've talked about community and those points, maybe just a reiteration of what that is, and then how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, thank you. I really don't, as I say that, I don't know that I have any other tips other than listen to the voice of your soul. Mm-hmm. Start there. I mean, if you can't do that, then the rest of it's sort of a moot point,
Right.
And understand that it will feel like death. In fact, there's lots of breakthrough evidence, science and research in the last few years that grief, which is what ego death is part of, is treated like physical pain by the brain. Mm. It produces a similar response as if you're getting your arm cut off.
Yeah.
So it's extremely painful. But in that process of of sitting in the grief and the pain and the sorrow and the loss and everything is, again, where you find the indestructible, unbreakable parts of yourself. Mm. As far as getting in touch with me, I post not every day, but most days, 1 to 2 musings on Foster Thinking on Instagram. You can friend me on Facebook. I'm not super active on Twitter anymore. It's become sort of like way too much like the same traits as a family reunion.
Yeah, I get it, man.
And then you can go to my personal website at fosterthinking.com and sign up for my email list, and you get my every week in your inbox, you get my Monday essay the following Friday. But I love conversations. And so if somebody hears this and wants to talk further, just reach out. I'm very, very accessible.
Yeah. So. That's awesome. And I highly recommend everyone following if you're not already, and getting those emails. And it's just so fun, man, to be able to have you on and chat. And it's so good. The Insta friendship.
Someday we'll meet in real life.
We will. We will. I mean, here's the thing, man. I'm in San Diego, and it seems like everybody in Southern California is heading your way to Austin.
Yes, right.
So I feel like it's a matter of time before I at least have to go visit people there,
Yeah. Now Elon Musk is coming. So
yeah, you got Joe Rogan. I mean, you got, which I have had an interest in Austin for many years. And I'm going to just, as we just this could be like bonus content, you know. But I watched back in the day the Real World on MTV, and they
Yeah.
did the Real World Austin,
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Austin, and
Yeah.
ever since then I was like super intrigued with Austin because there's I'm a musician, you know,
Right.
and I'm like, I don't like the vibe of Tennessee. Being in Indianapolis, we're only like 3 or 4 hours from Nashville, but I was like, man, Austin seems way more rad of a music city than
Yeah.
Nashville.
Yes, it is.
And yeah, and it's proven to be true, but this is back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s.
Right.
And so I've always had an interest in that. And I'm like, dang, because I always thought if I moved to Texas, it would be Austin, but now it's like too trendy and I don't want to be too mainstream now, you know?
You could go live in like New Braunfels or something where, you know, a bunch of musicians live because it's expensive to live in Austin. So they live in New Braunfels or San Marcos and places like that. And it is a mystical place. And, you know, I miss live music tremendously. But art gets expressed here.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's subversive and a lot of it is non-mainstream, whatever it may be. And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's South by Southwest is there, right? Well,
right. Yeah.
you know, whenever that was
When it
a
comes
thing.
back. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, yeah, man. So as we part ways on Zoom here, I'm sure at some point I'd love to come and see you. So thank you so much.
I'll head to San Diego when it's like in September, when it's 98 degrees and 98% humidity.
Yeah. Come here and relax. And when the water's warm and,
or go up to the mountains. Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. All right, brother. Thank you for this. Appreciate you very much. Appreciate what you're doing.
Likewise, man. Thank you.
All right.